begin at the beginning, and when you come to the end, stop. That's logic. Hi friends, and welcome back to Wonderland. Just kidding. Welcome back to Cammie's Corner. I guess you can call this my muchness, because when it comes to Alice, I have too much muchness to talk about. So what is this all about, you say? Well, for the month of November, if you are following me on any of my other social media networks, you know that I have decided to do a fall into the classics. Get it? Fall leaves, fall into the classics. When I think of fall, I think of cooler weather, cozying up with a blanket, and a really good book. And what better books to do that with than classics? Now, I'm ashamed to say I haven't read a lot of classics in my day. However, I thought this was a good opportunity to try to read as many classics as I could in the month of November. Now, my normal book review is up on my website. So, of course, if you're new here, I do have a website. It's cammiescorner.org. Welcome, go subscribe, check it out. The book reviews will continue on the website, but I wanted to try for this month to do a few visual book reviews. And with this first novel, I let you decide, you, my viewers, my friends, my followers. I put a poll together of 5 what I feel are pretty popular classics, and by an overwhelming margin, 56% of the votes came back that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was going to be our first read. I've got to say, I was really excited but super overwhelmed because I don't know where to begin. I just have so much knowledge about Wonderland and all things Alice that there's so much I want to share with you. But I have to keep this short and sweet and not overwhelm you with everything at once. So I'll just give you a few tidbits. We'll talk about the book, and then you can tell me what else you might want to know. Reverend Charles Ludwig Dawson was by day a brilliant mathematician at Oxford University. Now, when I think of Charles Dodgson, I liken him to Will Hunting from Good Will Hunting. Now, you might say, why? Well, if you think about the character Will Hunting, everything came so easy to him. Everything was just second nature. He was just so smart. He had a photographic mind, and he was just able to remember everything he read. Whereas Charles was a brilliant mathematician. He had a very difficult time adapting in society. He didn't really have a lot of adult friends. Truthfully, many people looked upon him with weirdness and disdain, and they didn't really know how to take him. Now, when he was 17, he developed whooping cough. Through that whooping cough, unfortunately, he also kept part of that with him through life. He had what we call a stammer or a stutter. He called it a hesitation. But I think for him, that was a huge societal setback, and he saw it as kind of another reason to stay away from other adults. Now, let's fast forward to a boat trip in May of 1862, and we will have the birth of Lewis Carroll. There, he decided to tell a story at the request of a little girl by the name of Alice Liddell. Oh yes, Alice was real. There's no two bones about it. Alice was a middle child of an Oxford professor who became very enamored with Charles and everything he was about. She often asked him to tell stories. So it is under the understanding from a historical perspective that Charles created these adventures just for Alice. Now, there is also a rumored documentation that Alice in Wonderland was actually written 4 different ways. That it was kind of more like a journal entry that Charles would do. Now, who's to say if that was the case, because from the understanding of the whole story, if you will, is that as Charles began to develop this story under his pseudonym Lewis Carroll, he started to do away with the original versions. Now, it is stated that somewhere between 1862 and 1865, when Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was first published, that he presented Alice with a copy of The Adventures in Wonderland that became what is known as Alice's Adventures Underground. I happen to have a copy of that, and it is kind of a Alice adventure all in of its own. So if you've never read this, but you have read Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, you'll find that this fits in beautifully with it. Whether or not it was truly Lewis Carroll is, you know, to be determined, but you make your own imagination. So who's Alice Liddell, you ask? Well, again, she's a wonderful, young, charming girl who, in essence, kind of grew up alongside Charles. If you want to know more about her, I will put this book in the description. This is called The Other Alice, and this kind of gives a story of her life and who she was and kind of the relationship that she shared with Charles. Now, in addition to being a mathematician at one of the most prestigious universities, Oxford, and changing forever children's literature, Charles Dodgson was also a photographer. Well before the idea of Alice ever came to life, he had some amazing photographs. Again, I'll leave this in the description box. This is called Dreaming in Pictures. This is probably the one and only book I have ever seen of Charles's work as a photographer. He became a photographer in 1856, much around the time that he created Lewis Carroll. And his photographs are just charming. The understanding from the historical documentation vantage point is that he was trying to recreate Eden, and through his vision of Eden he saw the beauty and the innocence of children. There is some speculation and curiosities as to why he photographed children. These are in no way distasteful, there's no nudity, anything of that nature, so I don't know why it's often curious, no pun intended, why he photographed children. He asked for parental consent. Most of these parents went to him asking to have their children photographed by him because he had such a beautiful way of capturing the Victorian era. So why he chose not to continue with this, I don't know, maybe it was just a hobby. And he did take quite a few pictures of Alice Liddell. So again, if you want to know more about who he was beyond Oxford and beyond Alice, he really was quite an intriguing person. So back to Wonderland. Of course, having been kind of a social outcast and having a better connection with children, I think that for Charles, his relationship that developed with Alice really is completely visual in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You kind of see that as Charles is writing, you know, he started the writing in 1862. It wasn't published until 1865. So he had a decade to kind of put this together, in that he watched Alice grow up. Now we all know as we grow up, there are parts and elements of us that we have to kind of come to terms with. Things that we might have otherwise dismissed or thought was silly at some point, or why do I have to do that? I mean, doesn't that happen all the time? Mom, why? Why do I have to do this? Well, kids, there's always a reason why you're asked to do something, and there's always a lesson to be learned. One of my favorite lines in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is that everything's got a moral, if only you can find it. The Duchess says that, and it's really quite true. And as you see Alice go through her adventures in Wonderland, you see her kind of do a checks and balance system, if you will. She uses her education, which in that time, the Victorian era, education was very important. Education was considered to be a luxury of sorts. Not to say or dismiss that education isn't important today, but I think it was valued much different then, because it wasn't something that was just granted to everyone. It was quite a prestigious event. So as Alice continues her adventures, you not only see her education importance, you see that beautiful relationship between her and Charles, but you also see a lot of what was happening in England at that time. Now, I had mentioned, again, on my other social media network, the correlation between the eat me and the drink me that you see happen in the story, where Alice sort of questions things before she ingests them. there is no qualms that during that time it was very common for things to be placed throughout society for those that were not of the right stature. And that said, there was tons of people looking for food. They were hungry, they were poor. There was a very impoverished nation around the queen and around the castle. And so they would lay out food laced with poison to kind of thin out the population, if you will. So as Alice questions these items in the story, there is a very, important historical fact there that this was really happening during that time period. So a lot of this is, things that we take for granted and we dismiss. So for me, learning about the Victorian era and what was going on during that time was really important for me to understand the absurdities that were occurring in Wonderland. Because if you are like me and had read Alice in Wonderland for the first time, you were probably a bit taken aback. Like, what did I just read? Now, I read it for the first time in the 6th grade, and I'll be honest, I had tons of questions. I actually went back to my teacher that following Monday. It was introduced on a Friday, and I went back on Monday and I was like, what did I just read? And he said, read it again, keep reading it. And I love him for it, because he is the reason why I became so enamored with all things Wonderland. But it's true, as you read the story and you reread it and you learn more about the author and you understand the poetic tie-ins, it's just a very magical story. Now, the one that I had chosen for the readathon was actually a children's version, and this is the Dalmatian Press, The Great Classics for Children. This is actually an abridged version and condensed version of the story. So it has more pages than most Alice versions. This one's about 181 pages. However, being that it is abridged and condensed, there's a lot more pictures. Now, there have been a ton of adaptations of Alice over the years. It's a very hard story to tweak, so there's not a lot of change or variation in the words, but you'll notice that in a children's version, a lot of the poetry is taken out. One of the coolest books I stumbled across, and this was at Barnes & Noble in the children's poetry section, was Poetry for Young People, and there are quite a few of these. They have, different poets that you can obtain. But this is Lewis Carroll's works, and I think this is really important for children to read this, because like I stated, a lot of the children's versions, the poetry has been removed. And so this will allot for some of that missing, those missing words and that connection to be visualized here. Now, you'll have both the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland as well as Through the Looking Glass here. So again, description box, highly recommend this book. It's great for kids of any age, but there's also some explanations. So getting through the poetry, sometimes this can help adults too. Tons of fun. With Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think for the overall understanding is the moral, and the lesson is just that. There are morals and lessons to be learned as you're growing up. And we're kind of watching Alice as she's questioning her adventure grow up and make the realization that a lot of what she's learning, a lot of that which is around her is changing, and she has to adapt to that change. And as she goes through Wonderland and she encounters familiarities in these characters, she's also using the lessons of her reality to kind of make her way through and find her way back home. That depiction continues in Through the Looking Glass, and I think I'll revisit that at a later time and definitely read that and talk with you about it, because a lot more of the Victorian era depictions of what was really going on is really laced in the Through the Looking Glass. There are tidbits that, I think maybe Charles was a little bit cautious in the first one to not give too much away or make it seem like he was not grateful for his dance, because, again, he came from a very prestigious family. He was the third child in a family of 11 children, all of which made it to adulthood, which is very rare for that time period. He was the oldest of the boys. There was 4 boys and 7 girls, and there's not a lot of discussion about his personal life, you know, how his parents were, other than it did state that he was 19 when his mom died. She died under rather scary circumstances. She had perhaps either meningitis or a stroke, and she had swelling and inflammation of the brain, and it was a really sad story. But I don't find a lot of information about his father. So, you know, again, a lot to be said about the man, and a lot of who he was helps you understand the story. So I hope you enjoyed going through Wonderland with me. I know that there is a lot more to learn. I did promise whoever decided to tune into this video and hear me talk about Alice's adventures in Wonderland that I would give my, I guess, opinion on the Mad Hatter. Now, this you won't find in the book, but you will find it in the movie adaptation that was done by Tim Burton. Now, if you've never seen the movies, I highly recommend you do so. Of course, you have the original Alice in Wonderland, and then you have the follow-up, Alice in Through the Looking Glass. One of the things I want to mention is that Johnny Depp and Tim Burton are very method. And by that I mean they put their heart and soul into everything, every project that they touch. Tim Burton is genius is, I don't even think that's the right word to use. He is just so incredibly talented. And Johnny Depp is beyond a method actor. I mean, every part he touches, he becomes. And the Mad Hatter is no exception. Now again, I don't know if this was Burton or if this was Johnny Depp, but I know one of them had to have read more into who Reverend Charles Ludwig Dawson was, because I think that if you reach the scene at the end of this movie where the Mad Hatter and Alice are having a moment, and the Mad Hatter is coming to the realization that he may never see Alice again, and Alice is having that same epiphany. This might be it. I might not have a reason to come back. I think I've done everything that I can possibly do here. I have slain the Jabberwocky. I'm ready. I'm ready to take on the world. The Mad Hatter looks at Alice and he wants to be sad, but in the same respect, he wants to be happy for her. And I believe in that moment, you can see Charles in the Mad Hatter. And you can see the real Alice. And you just kind of visualize what that last conversation between the two must have been like. Knowing that they were completely enamored with each other. Their friendship meant everything to them. But they had to grow up. Charles had to let Alice grow up. She had to go on and experience life. And I think it was in that moment when you see the truth behind his eyes as he looks upon Alice and he lets her go. In a sense, you kind of feel Charles there for a moment. So again, that's just my opinion. I really think that if you learn more about Charles and you know who the man was, I think in that moment, in that movie, you can really see Charles in the Mad Hatter. And he has a stammer. I don't know if he did that intentionally or if it was just part of it. It's just, I don't know. It's an incredibly beautiful thing to watch. And I tear every time I see it because I have such a respect and an admiration for everything that this story is. And to say that I'm the only one would be an understatement, because if you look at all of the novels that are out there that really play off of just this story, you have this great series by Wendy Spinale. This is the second in the series, but this is all about an Alice spin-off. You have this by Peter Abrams, Down the Rabbit Hole. Now this is part of a series, but this all takes place around a play of Alice in Wonderland. One of my absolute favorites is Frank Beddor. He actually has two. He has a series of graphic novels that are absolutely geniusly illustrated, and this is kind of on the cusp of the twisted Alice McGee game and that which is the regular Alice. So if you haven't checked him out, you really need to. He's incredible. But then you have the regular series, and this is the Looking Glass Wars. This actually kind of puts Alice in the place of being the next queen of Wonderland. So you can see Charles has touched so many people in so many ways that all of these books, all of these movies, all of these adaptations are an extension of his imagination. He virtually changed children's literature to create a completely different outlook on it. He allowed the beauty of what is to be a child be heard. And for me, that's the biggest lesson, is that children shouldn't be silenced, that there is much to be learned from children, and there is much to be respected from the imagination of a child. So that is my review. That is my true feelings of the book. That is my true feelings of the author. And I hope that for the moment that you shared with me here in my version of Wonderland, that you learned something new about the author, about the book, and perhaps it sparked questions. So I can't wait to dig into Through the Looking Glass, and that will definitely come at some point. And I think we should revisit Alice, because this was only the surface. There is so much more to discuss and so much more knowledge that I possess. But to continue on the fall into the classics, we have actually chosen the next book from the jar. I say we, but you guys were watching on Facebook Live, and I selected Treasure Island. So I'm really excited. I am going to stick with these Dalmatian Press, the Great Classics for Children. Again, they are abridged and they are condensed, so I am kind of shortening the story. The Treasure Island version for this is about 100 pages less than the adult Robert Louis Stevenson version, but at least that'll allow me to get in a ton of classics and kind of get a feel for the children's books and how they're written, and maybe do some comparison contrast as far as what's missing. Alas, I must get back to reality. But again, I hope you've enjoyed spending a few minutes in Wonderland with me. I hope you've learned something, and please drop me a comment. Let me know what you thought about my thoughts. Let me know what you think about the book. And if you did join in on the readathon with me and you read along, let me know what your favorite part was. Honestly, my favorite part will always be the caucus race. I just find it so humorous that they continually run in circles in water thinking that they're going to get dry. It's too muchness. But until next time, friends, thank you so much for joining me at Cammie's Corner, and I hope you like this version, the video version of the book review. And definitely still check out the website. I will continue to do book reviews there at cammiescorner.org. Until next time, you take care. Bye.